Good afternoon. All right, we can do a little better than that. I know it's cold outside and rainy. Good afternoon. Thank you. I wanted to welcome and thank each of you for being here for our third Medical and Social Science lecture series. This lecture series is in partnership with the College of Sciences, College of Education, College of Health Affairs, College of Liberal Arts, and the School of Medicine, and it is aimed at creating an enduring conversation series on the intersection of social science and medicine to engage, shape, and inform faculty and student life at UTRGV. Currently, this lecture is sponsored by the Seed Texas Grant, or the Social Innovations for a Healthy South Texas, and it is supported by the Social Innovations Fund, Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas, and the Valley Baptist Legacy Foundation. So we are very thankful for their continuous investment in this effort. In partnership with all of our colleges, we hope to make these lecture series a permanent part of our culture and life at UTRGV. Now, as a graduate student and an undergraduate student, I did go to school. It is special lectures like these that fed my curiosity, broadened my thinking, and introduced me to topics that continues to shape my life even today. So it is our hope both faculty and students are inspired to take something new and make connections they have not made before after the lecture. So in fact, here's a little mindful homework for you as you sit through the lectures. I hope you can take note of ideas, concepts, words, arguments that you may hear that grab your attention, and perhaps that can interest you in a new research topic. Perhaps that can help you take a new course that you hadn't thought of, or even some career decisions that may really change your trajectory. So today, we have Dr. Andy Keller with us today, and I'll get to him in a minute. And in March, we'll have Dr. Frank DeGrey, who will be coming down. Now, so an older fish was swimming by when he saw two younger fish approach him. And so he said, "Hey, boys, how's the water these days?" And the young ones looked puzzled at the older one and said, "Water? What's that?" So very similar to that question, many of you may look at some of the topics for today and say, policy? What's policy? Policy to me is the water that all of us swim in, yet are not aware of its far-reaching impact on our everyday life. All of us are here in this great institution, enjoy the privileges of education and academia because policies were passed long time ago. So we have the privilege of doing that today. If you were alive in the past 10 years, you probably heard all the great national debates about our own healthcare policy in the United States. Now, I may have lost some of you, or I saw your eyes glaze over when I mentioned the word policy. While I cannot guarantee a behavioral or an attitudinal change to your response when you hear the word policy, I can guarantee that you will walk away more informed about the water that we all swim in. It affects our healthcare today, especially in terms of integration of mental health. And we cannot think of anyone more qualified and brilliant than Dr. Andy Keller to inform and teach us about the water we swim in. Dr. Keller is a CEO of M.A.S.S Mental Health Policy Institute in Texas, and he's a licensed psychologist. He's a nationally recognized leader in health and human services integration, behavioral health financing, and implemented several evidence-based innovative approaches for both adults and children. MMHPI is a premier policy organization in Texas and have made impressive leaps in advancing mental health conversation and policy in the state. You will easily witness today his passion and expertise in the field as you hear from him, and easily recognize why he is a trusted name nationally in health policy. So please put your hands together for a warm welcome to Dr. Andy Keller on a relatively cold day at UTRGV.
I think I don't have this on yet, so I'm going to try again. Turn this on. Is it on? How about? I might have. Oh, hey. I just didn't wait long enough. Hey, everybody. Thank you for that very gracious introduction, and thank you all for being here today and for the opportunity to come talk with you all about policy, because that really does sound quite boring, but we'll try to make it not be that way. But I am mostly excited to be in the Valley today because I grew up in the Valley. Not this Valley, But I grew up in a valley in Washington State, the Yakima Valley, which in many ways is like this valley. So when I hear people talk about the valley, it makes me feel all warm and at home because every member of my family still lives there other than me. I'm the black sheep of my family who went to school for too long, couldn't be satisfied as an apple farmer, even though in many ways it was an awesome childhood, and now I live somewhere else. One thing, though, that's different about my valley is I grew up thinking that the valley actually was a valley, like that there would be mountains, right, on each side, and you could, like, orient yourself to which way was north, because that's where Mount Clemens was, and which way was south, because that's where Cowiche Mountain was. And I just decided that this must be what a Texas valley is like, that the valley is so big that you actually can't see the mountains or any other features. It's just a huge valley. And then someone was telling me it's got to do with marketing an electrical company and trying to get everybody to move here. But regardless, it's great to be in the valley. And I do feel really at home here, not just because of some of the similarities to where I grew up, but also because you all are doing some really cool things here that we're super excited about at the Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute. So we're going to talk some about that. But one thing, before I get into that, I want to do, actually, what do I want to do? First, I want to do a survey. So I'm a psychologist, so I like data. So I need to know kind of who's in my audience here. So I'm going to ask you some questions, and then just to kind of help me figure that out. So how many folks here primarily consider themselves healthcare providers? Does anybody fall into that category? Just a couple. And more medical or more psychology or more what? Like, I know you, but what about him? Oh, okay. Then I got that. So you're both. Both is the answer there. How many folks primarily consider themselves researchers? Researchers, good. Data people, yay. That's good. How about educators? Anybody? Yes, excellent. How about students? All right. Now, on students, how many folks are like students in like the medical field? Students in a behavioral field? Students in another field I didn't ask about? What is that? Like, give me an example. Biology, okay, cool. Philosophy, who philosophy? I was a philosophy, that's good. Engineering, my son's an engineer, awesome. Good, so we got a diverse group. So who is in a category I haven't asked about yet? Or who has another category that they want to tell me about? Yes, sir. Music, awesome, great. Psychology, awesome. All right, good. Anybody? All right, good. So I have some idea who I'm talking about today. So I'm going to be talking a lot about the delivery of medical services and the policy things that influence that. And one thing I think that can bring us all together today is that all of us either have or will have our lives touched by mental or other behavioral health concerns at some point. We've done surveys at the Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute of Texas voters. And one reason we survey Texas voters is because we're a policy institute. And so one of the things that policy means is politics and political leaders and who makes decisions. So when I go talk to a legislator about something that I'd like them to do differently in the state of Texas, they want to know what the people who are likely to vote will say. And what we found is that 75% of Texas voters have a family member or a friend or some other loved one or themselves who've been impacted by mental illness. And that's a big number. The most interesting thing about that number, from my perspective, is it's the exact same number who endorsed that same question for cancer. About 75% of Texans say their lives have been impacted by cancer. About 75% of Texans say their lives have been impacted by mental illness. So your life has been impacted, will be impacted, is being impacted, whether you know it or not. And so it's really important that when mental illness becomes an illness, when it gets to the level of it's no longer health, but it's something that's a disorder that interferes with functioning, that the medical system be able to help with that. And hence, the title of my talk, which hopefully some of you will find interesting, especially if you like murder mysteries or like gory things, we're going to talk about reattaching a head to a body. That's what today is about. How does medicine reattach the head to the body? And I wanted to tell you one other thing about politics before, or about policy before they do that, because the other thing that's important to know about policy is in addition to being about politics and power and decision making, it's also about one other thing. Can anybody guess what the other main thing that policy is about is? Money. It's about money. What you pay for and what you don't pay for and what you actually pay people to not to do affects people. And one thing I found as a psychologist is that a lot of psychologists, I think the psychologists can hopefully relate to this, their brains freeze when there's dollar signs in front of the numbers. Now, you may not understand this, but the numbers actually divide and multiply and add exactly the same way when there's dollar signs in front of them. But a lot of us come into this with the belief that we're here to help people. We're not here to worry about money. We're not here to worry about power. We're here to help people, particularly in the mental health field, because we're dealing with people in pretty vulnerable situations, people whose emotions are not working the way they wanted, people whose families aren't working the way they wanted, people whose cognitive processes or perceptive processes and hallucinations are not working the way they wanted. So folks are pretty vulnerable, so money is generally not a motivator for folks to go into mental health, and if it was a motivator, you probably made a very bad decision. Because this is not a great field to be. Go be an orthopedic surgeon. Go be a cardiovascular person. That's where the money is in medicine. But following the money and understanding that is an important thing to do to be able to help make medicine better. Because I promise you, if you go into a medical field, at some point you're going to wonder about whether you're going to get paid. Because you're going to have rent, you're going to have children, you're going to have other things. So money is important, we just don't tend to prioritize as much. So we're going to talk about that today and talk about how that has shaped our field, how it's led us to do some weird things in our field, and how it's led us to hopefully do some better things in the near future. So let me tell you first about the M.A.S.S Mental Health Policy Institute, or as I like to call it, MMHPI, because it's much quicker to say that, or the Institute. So the Institute, we're pretty young. We've only been around for 4 years. And anybody who's a developmental psychologist knows about 4-year-olds. 4-year-olds have begun to talk and become lippy. We've kind of moved out of the 3-year-old thing, but we still get in trouble, but we're mostly climbing on things and causing trouble. That's very much what we're about at the M.A.S.S Mental Health Policy Institute. We're here to be a disruptive force to get medicine to treat the brain differently. And our goal is not for Texas to move from 43rd to 37th in per capita funding for mental health, which we have, by the way, in the last 4 years. And I'll talk about what that means in a sec. But it's to have Texas be the national leader in treating people with mental health needs. Because in Texas, if you haven't figured this out yet, we like being the best. And while I didn't grow up in Texas, I am a got here as soon as you could Texan, and I'm totally bought into us being the best. And so the way we do that is by being basically a trusted, nonpartisan source for being able to provide policymakers. And that includes not just lawmakers, but people who run state agencies, county officials, people who run health systems, people who run foundations, make better decisions. And we are funded almost entirely by philanthropy. So Methodist Healthcare Ministries and Valley Baptist Legacy Foundation are part of why we're here. 98% of the funds that support my family and my kids come from those organizations, and we're very much indebted to them. But the big value equation we have at the Institute, and I need to push these buttons more gently, is the synergy between state and local policy. Because some of you may not have realized this yet, but Texas is really big. When I was booking my travel here, I thought, well, I got to be in Houston I was in Houston yesterday, so I asked my assistant, because I still haven't totally accepted the distances. I said, can I drive from Houston? She said, sure, if you have 5 hours. And I'm like, okay, we'll fly. But I mean, it's a big state, 244 counties. There's 234 jails in Texas. So if you want jail policy, you can't just go to the state and say, we want to change jail policy. Every sheriff in every town in Texas runs their jail, and believe me, every one of them is just as important as the other one. Every one of them was elected, every one of them controls law enforcement in their county, and they make the decision. So you can't just go to Austin, you got to go talk to the sheriff. And guess what happens to sheriffs? They get reelected and they change. So you get a sheriff who's really into mental health and doing alternative things and helping people not go to the jail, and then they lose election because they were too soft on crime. They weren't like, whatever, or some other reason. They decide not to run, and you got to start all over again. So that's kind of discouraging, but it's also kind of fun if you can get momentum going. And we'll talk about that interplay. And so our job at the Institute is to really help your local health systems, both the ones here where you currently live, but also the ones many of you are going to be working in or living in over your lives, have the kind of policies and relationships with state regulators to make things work. Now, let me give you an example. My grandma is a farmer. My grandma and grandpa, they immigrated over, their families did in the early 1900s. They homesteaded in Washington State in the 30s because during the Depression, a lot of public works were done to open up new farmland and whatnot. And so they settled there and they started farming. My grandpa stopped school in 8th grade. My grandma made it all the way through high school. And so she was the educated matriarch of the family. So when I continued to go to school after college, because they were pretty sure I should go to college, when I was continuing to go to school, they would frequently say, why are you still going to school? And my grandma and I developed this thing over the years where she would say, what is it you do again? I know that you're a doctor, but you're not a real doctor. You're a psychologist. And I know you don't really do clinical care anymore, because I've seen the Bob Newhart show. I know what a psychologist is like, but you don't actually do that. So what do you do? And so I said, well, Grandma, here, we did this project in Yakima, the town I grew up in, around kinship care. Anybody heard of kinship care before? Okay, let me tell you what that is. Foster care system pays foster parents to take care of children who are abused, neglected, or otherwise cannot live at home and are wards of the state. So foster parents are paid to take care of them. Kinship care says, well, why don't we see if grandma or the aunt or the uncle or the sister or someone else in the family would actually like to take care of that child, someone who's safe, someone who will do a good job, and maybe we should actually give them a little bit of extra money too because they didn't budget to have that child. So kinship care creates structures to make sure those families can do a good job and gives them additional supports to take care of their family member. So I was explaining this to my grandma, that we were doing a study to show that that worked. And my grandma said, so let me make sure I understand this. You are doing a study to prove that it's better for a child to live with their family than to live with a stranger. And I said, yeah, pretty much, Grandma. She said, that is a good deal. Well done, son. So the proving of obvious things and getting decision makers to make obvious decisions is a big part of what you need to do in mental health policy. So let's talk, well, before we get into that, I just want to talk a little bit about this. And I'll come back to this slide. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But there's a relationship between what we do in health systems and what we do with health policy, and then what goes on in the culture. And one of the biggest things we have to fight against in the culture with mental illness is stigma. There's a special stigma around mental illness. We tend to think, well, you know, the mind, what is the mind? The brain is so complex. It's a spiritual thing. And what's the difference between you're just not tough, you're not, you know, strong enough to kind of go take care of yourself, and a mental illness? And that's a big thing in our culture, and there's a lot of debate around that. So I'm going to frequently come back to things that aren't just about policy, but are actually about culture, because all of those things are interrelated. The cool thing about that, though, is that if you can change policy and if you can change things, we can actually change the culture. And anybody who's looked at marriage policy, for example, in the last 10 years knows how quickly that can change and how much the culture can then change around that if we get the right policies in place. Regardless of how you feel about that, things can change. So let's start with a very basic policy question. Why isn't the head attached to the body in healthcare? So this drawing is a very busy drawing, and it's one that I don't expect you to fully assimilate, but I'm going to talk about some different parts of it. So what would good healthcare look like? Well, good mental health care. Good mental health care, in our view at the Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute, and this is the kind of thing my grandma would appreciate, looks like good health care. That's what it looks like. So let's think of an example of good health care. Today, we actually have some very nice protocols around the treatment of cancer. And I'm going to talk about a couple people in my family who've had cancer and what happened to them. And all of them in the current era have had happy endings. I'm going to talk about my grandma, who died back in 1986. She did not have a happy ending, but I'm going to talk about mostly happy stories on this. So let's talk about my mom. My mom was diagnosed just over 5 years ago with breast cancer. So what did my mom do to do that? Did she say, oh my gosh, I've got cancer, and run to the emergency room, or did she call the police? No, she went to her doctor. She was actually doing a self-exam at home. She felt something in her breast that felt unusual, and she went to the doctor. She called her OBGYN. Her OBGYN did a little bit of testing there in the primary care setting, and this is, by the way, over here, primary care. Primary care is the doctor you go to for everyday things. So my mom's main doctor she goes to as a woman is an OBGYN. So her doctor, that's how she likes to do it. Not every woman makes that choice, but my mom does. So my mom's doctor said, yeah, you know, looks like there's something going on here. So what did my mom's doctor do once she thought she had cancer? Because, you know, cancer is a big deal. Did she, send her to the hospital? Did she, call the police? Did she freak out? Did she call 911? Nope. She called an oncologist, which is a cancer specialist, and she scheduled her to go there. And she went and saw the cancer specialist, and the cancer specialist said, yes, you do have cancer. And so we're going to have to do surgery, and we're going to have to do radiation treatment. So that happened here. That's called specialty care. So then did they send my mom to an inpatient hospital? Did they send her to a hospital then? Because surgery, that's a big deal. That's pretty intensive. Nope. They did it in the outpatient clinic, because in my mom's little town in Washington State, there's an outpatient surgery center associated with a multi-specialty cancer practice. And in her little town, they were able to get her treatment. And it worked out great. Never went to a hospital, and she's doing good today. My other friend, who's about my age, went into his doctor, and he was having kind of indigestion, and so he went to his doctor, his regular doctor, primary care, and did some blood tests. They looked weird. He went down the same path my mom did. They sent him to a specialist. The specialist looked at his case, and he said, you have stage 4 colon cancer that's metastasized to your liver. You have stage 4 colon cancer, you get to go to the hospital because you have to have very serious surgery. And here's the thing that makes it different than the surgery my mom had. He could have died from the surgery. It's very serious surgery. They remove part of your colon, part of your liver. There's a lot of complications around that. So he went to one of the best hospitals in Seattle. So he got to have inpatient care. Now, if he'd had something really weird, he might have actually gone out of state to a place like MD Anderson in Houston. I was in San Francisco at a conference, and I saw an advertisement for MD Anderson. Think about that. There's like Stanford's there, all these health systems. We actually are so proud of the cancer work that goes on at MD Anderson that you can see advertisements for that really around the world because they want people to come there because they're doing cutting-edge research. And if you have something and nobody else knows what to do, as one person once said to me, those cowboys in Texas will cut it out and help you figure out how to live with it. That's what we do. So there's a whole system that really, and you know what MD Anderson's based on? They're not based on clinical care. That's really not why MD Anderson's so awesome. They're based on research. There are millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of research that go through that institution that make it the world-class place it is. And research doesn't just fund research. Research funds researchers and faculty members who in turn then can teach and be faculty members to expand residencies and build training and ultimately builds clinical care. So all of that stuff goes together. It's not just about having a cancer doctor. It's about having institutions that are world-class and doing super cool things. So that's what good medicine looks like. And you can kind of see it's not just about the medicine, it's about how we practice the medicine and what we do. So let's contrast that with mental illness. That's over here. So if you have a mental health condition, a severe mental health condition, on average you will not seek treatment for 5 years. No one will ask you about it in your primary care setting. Nobody will ask you about it at home because we don't talk about mental illness. In fact, if you have a mental illness, what families will do is kind of conspire to say that you really don't have a mental illness. That's what we did with my son. I was like, you know, he's just really bright and insightful, and of course he's down because the world is a harsh place. He's having ennui. He's not having depression. Where's my philosophy person? You know what I'm saying, like with ennui. So like he was going to be like my little philosopher. No, he was depressed, and it took me a while as a dad who's a psychologist to accept that because I didn't want him to be depressed because who the heck wants their kid to be depressed? It sucks, just in case you didn't know that. So we conspire to not do anything about that, and our doctors don't ask us. Because, by the way, no one wants to have cancer either. Has anybody ever watched The Crown? Have you watched The Crown? Okay. The Crown, member in The Crown, this is about Queen Elizabeth, current Queen of England, and her dad, King George, who died of cancer. In the first episode, sorry to be a spoiler, but they cut his lung out in the first episode. And you know when they told him he had cancer? 5 weeks after they cut his lung out. I mean, they didn't want to tell me he had cancer because it was like, you're going to die. And the first CEO of my organization was a bit older than I was, is in his 70s, Tom Luce, great policymaker in Texas, did a lot to get Texas education to where it is today. It's not in a great spot, but it's in a much better spot than it was than when Tom started working on it. And Tom would told me and reminded me that in 1974, Betty Ford came out and told the world that she had breast cancer. And this was a huge deal because you didn't use the B word or the C word in public back then because it was a mark of death. And the big reason my grandma died of cancer in 1986 was because nobody found it. The reason my grandma was diagnosed with cancer was she was visiting a friend in the hospital. She fell, she broke her hip. They took an x-ray of her hip to see if it was broken. And they said, oh my gosh, your body is riddled with cancer. You will soon die. That's what happened. And that's what we do now. We wait 5 years. And so what happens is somebody has a hallucination, right? Hallucinations, it's hard to go to school if you're having a hallucination. I mean, you're seeing things that aren't there, you're saying weird stuff, you're scaring your friends, you're scaring the teacher, and also you're not really paying attention, so it's hard to stay in school. So if we don't treat that, you're probably going to fall out of school because psychosis typically arises between the ages of 15 and your late 20s, about 15 to 30, let's say. So you're early in your career, you're early in your family, and it knocks you off a developmental track. And the things that are hard to treat with somebody who has schizophrenia are really not always the symptoms. It's often the homelessness, the not knowing how to take care of yourself, not knowing how to shop, all the things that my kids in college right now are learning. Like if my kids like froze developmentally, and if some of you froze developmentally right now with where you are, and I'm not really looking at anyone in particular, your life would suck because you wouldn't know how to take care of yourself. You wouldn't know how to do a lot of things. And that's what happens when a mental illness sets in, is you don't learn all these things that the rest of us who are old, like me, have had time to learn, like how to, you know, shower and dress nice and do all of these things that we have to learn how to do. So what happens is, therefore, we've organized our system around mental illness that the only person legally authorized in the state of Texas to involuntarily commit you, if you are psychotic, to a hospital is a police officer. So that means if you go to the emergency room of any hospital and you're psychotic, you bring, or let's say you bring your sister who's psychotic to that emergency room, and the doctors say, yes, your sister's psychotic. I know she doesn't know she's psychotic. She wants to leave the hospital, but we're going to order her into care. They can't do it until a police officer shows up. So that means in little towns around Texas, they have to wait hours for the sheriff's deputy to show up and to sign off on the doctor's diagnosis. How messed up is that? That is really messed up. And in fact, in almost any other state, there's only one other state that does that. Every other state I've been licensed in, I could put you in a hospital. Now, I could put you in a hospital if I wanted to, even if you're not ill, but then I'm going to get sued and use my license and all that kind of stuff. So there's ways to make sure I don't abuse that. Plus, it's not fun to put someone in a hospital. There's not a lot of people out there saying, gosh, I can't wait till I can put someone in a hospital. Can't wait to stay up all night, dealing with the paperwork. And so, but here, we don't want to let anybody do that, other than courts and the justice system. So therefore, what happens, everyone who is psychotic, everyone who is severely mentally ill, who needs inpatient care has contact with the criminal justice system, and it's a big reason why 1 in 5 people in our prisons and jails today in Texas have a mental illness. And about half of those people have a mental illness and don't need to be there. Because it's important to keep this in mind. There are people with cancer in our jails who are there because they held up a bank. If you do something illegal and you happen to have a mental illness or cancer, you still need to go to jail. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a person who is psychotic, standing on the side of the road, naked, yelling. Somebody called the police because it was scary. They got arrested, and they got taken to jail and arrested because it's illegal to stand naked on the side of the street, just in case you didn't know that. But is that really the best answer? I mean, is the best answer to take that person to jail, or is a better answer to go talk to that person, figure out if they did commit a crime, figure out if they're going to kill themselves, or figure out if they're just, in a really weird state, weird, that's a technical term, weird, unusual, people don't know what you're doing. And we just maybe need to put a blanket around him, take him in, calm him down, have him chill out, and then have someone take him to the doctor in the morning. So what we did this week in Dallas was we introduced these teams called Right Care teams, which consist of a police officer, because you got to have a police officer because they're the only ones that are legally authorized to do it, a social worker, and an emergency medical service provider, an EMS provider. And it's a paramedic team. So think how cool that is. In Dallas today, actually Monday, it starts on Monday. If you have a psychiatric emergency in South Dallas, you're going to have a paramedic come to you, not a police officer. How cool is that? But here's how hard that was to get in place. When we introduced that legislation, Senate Bill 344, we didn't introduce it. Senator West from Dallas introduced it. There was tremendous opposition from, guess who? The mental health community. Isn't that perplexing? Why would the mental health community fight something like that? They were worried that people were going to get charged for ambulance rides. And it's a legitimate worry. I mean, if you're indigent, you have no money, and the ambulance takes you and you get a bill, that's the last thing you need, right? And they were thinking only about that, and so they were therefore willing to have every single person in Texas who needed to go to the hospital be forced to ride either in the back of a police car handcuffed or handcuffed in the back of an ambulance with a police officer overseeing them. Think of the trauma of that. Think of the stigma of that. Think how horrible that is for you as a family member to watch your loved one be carted off by the police and to feel like that was your fault because you're the one who called 911, which thank goodness you did. That's how we're organized. So let's go back. That's like saying that my mom, when my dad discovered she had cancer, freaked out, called 911 because you can die from cancer, it's a big deal, and the police came and handcuffed my mom and took her not to the outpatient facility, but took her to an inpatient facility or to jail. That's what we do. So we have this cycle of jail, inpatient care, law enforcement, and all we do and all we tend to pay for is the inpatient stay. And we'll pay for outpatient therapy. Oh, I think I'm too close to this. Can I retire this? Yeah, cool. Because I'm going to do that again, I promise you. Can I just give it to you? Thanks, stupid. So what we do is we pay for the hospital, we pay for the clinic appointment, but if you get out of the hospital after 3 days with a psychosis, are you going to be in any kind of shape, especially if you're homeless or have had 5 years go by since you started getting diagnosed, you're kind of alienated from your family? How are you going to get to that clinic appointment? Most people don't go to the clinic appointment. And so what they do is they fall through the cracks, and their medication wears off. Maybe they were given 30 days of medication. They never get any more medication. Oh, they're only given medication. I mean, my mom didn't just get medication. She got outpatient rehabilitation. She got all these other things. So that's what we do today. So that's messed up. And we're going to talk about how that can get better. So let's talk about why. Why did this happen? And I'm not going to go through this entire slide, but I want to illustrate a couple things. One is we didn't do a good job differentiating between brain illness and brain health. And let me tell you what you mean. And anybody who's a therapist in this room knows what I'm talking about, but most of you aren't, so I'm going to have to tell you. If you come into almost any therapist's office in America in the last 20 years and you're depressed, they're going to talk to you about your depression. But they're also going to ask you how everything else is going. And once your depression is healed, they're probably going to keep talking to you about all the other things in your life that could get better because you don't get along that well with your husband. You don't get along that well with your kids. You're not doing it. You have questions, and almost everybody does because mental health is complex. Where is the line between the treatment of the mental illness, which was the depression, which got you into the doctor, and the promotion of mental health? So let me give you an analogy. When I had to go to physical therapy for my hand, which was numb, I went into the physical therapist, and they gave me all these things to do. And a lot of it was like a massage, and like people would come talk to me, and they were all like cool and good looking, and everybody kind of like fawned on me, and I loved it. I got better. I did these exercises. I was motivated. And after 14 sessions, they said, "You're done." And I said, "I'm not done. My hand is still numb." And they said, "I know, but you need to keep doing these exercises yourself for the next 3 months, and then it'll be better. But you're done with us." And I'm like, "Well, no, I'd like to keep coming. You could give me pointers." And they go, "Yeah, we have that. It's down the road. It's called a sports trainer. It's called a gym. So like, get off your butt, go to the gym, do that kind of stuff." There's a very clear line in physical therapy between the healing and the rehabilitation of the injury and the promotion of health. And promotion of health happens in gyms. It happens with trainers. It happens at CrossFit. It doesn't happen. Actually, CrossFit's really good because you get injured and you go back to the physical therapist. But there's this sort of synergy. We don't do that in mental health. You get into therapy, and what happened in the 80s was we were doing therapy forever. I worked in an inpatient psychiatric hospital in the 80s. We had kids come in, and it was shocking to us that we had to discharge them after 3 months and not a whole year. How could you possibly heal a child's life and improve their relationship with their family without keeping them in a hospital for a year? First of all, how messed up is that? How could you screw up a kid's life by putting them in a hospital for a year? I mean, we weren't thinking at all about what real life is. We teach these little kids to like have I feel statements and to confront people, and then they would go back to the playground and get beat up because they sounded like, little provocative, weird kids. Because we taught them to be weird. We taught them to talk in a weird way and to say, "I feel angry that you are beating me up, Billy." And Billy said, "Well, how does this feel?" I mean, we didn't really think about the lives these children were leaving. We just thought about how much insurance they had, how much good we could do, and why would they want to leave our wonderful psychiatric hospital facility in anything less than a year? Because we're so wonderful. That was what we did. So the other thing we did was we don't define the illness clearly, and we argue about things that we don't need to argue about. So guess what? If you go in for cancer, actually, let's use surgery. Anybody had surgery before? Anybody have a family member that had surgery before? Anybody a surgeon in here? Good, I can be honest. Okay, you go in for surgery. I promise you they're going to tell you, "We can take care of this." "Oh, yeah, we can take care of this. It's not going to hurt that bad. Yeah, there'll be a little bit of pain, but you'll be fine. We'll get you through it. We'll get you back up on your feet. You'll be fine." They don't go in there and talk about, if they went in there and talked like therapists did, they'd say, "Well, we're pretty sure that we can take care of that. I mean, we don't always. We don't always take care of it. It doesn't always work out. In fact, in 35% of cases, people don't regain functioning. And in 35% of cases, they regain only partial functioning. And it's only really 30% of people who fully regain functioning. I mean, just to be honest. I feel like I should be honest with you. And, it's going to really hurt. And, we probably can't fully control your pain. I mean, we can give you oxytocin and give you other things, but you're probably not going to want to take that. Or if you do, you probably will have an addiction, and we'll need to treat that. But that will go on for several months. Probably after several months, the pain will remit to enough to where you're able to actually function again. But maybe not, because some people, I just have to be honest with you, some people actually will have pain their entire lives and will have a chronic injury that they will never recover from. So would you like to have surgery? I mean, people would say no. So what I'd like to do, I was telling Deepu this, we just need to put surgeons in charge of mental health for a week. And just come in, I think everything will be good, because you'll come into the doctor and they'll say, "Doctor, I think I have depression." "Oh, you definitely have depression. We can take care of that. Here. We're going to take care of that. You take this pill. You're not going to notice it for like a couple of weeks, but after that, you will be fine." And the 30% will be, and then the 70% who aren't, well, some people do have to take another pill. Sorry, we didn't get into that. Well, I did. I gave you a piece of paper that said that, but I didn't really emphasize that. Here is actually the other pill you're going to take, and now you're going to be fine. "Oh, well, you're one of the 10% of people who don't remit to a regular treatment. Well, we're going to have to send you over here. Oh, you need ketamine treatment to get rid of your chronic..." I mean, like the surgeons would railroad you through and figure out some way to charge you, because they sure as heck wouldn't let anybody be seen without getting paid, and they'd be clever enough to figure out how to get you all to give them a lot of money and talk you into it. That's what we don't have in mental health. We are apologetic, we're sweet, we don't do a good job. Last thing, we don't have anything that tells you got better. My mom was told last month that she is in remission from her cancer. She's cancer-free. Isn't that awesome? She got told she's cancer-free. How happy does my mom feel? Very happy. Is my mom cancer-free? Does my mom lack the systemic factors in her body, the chronic conditions that ultimately gave rise to a cancerous growth in her breast? No. She has exactly the same body. They cut it out. They radiated the site. It's not growing back, but she continues to be at risk for another growth. Do they tell her that? Yeah, they mention it, but they don't emphasize that. They emphasize, you're better. Do we do that for depression? Have any of you who practice mental health ever told your patient who's depressed that they're in remission from their depression? Would you even know what that meant? Do we have protocols? American Airlines does. American Airlines actually has protocols when their pilots are depressed for how soon they can come back to work. That's fantastic. That makes a lot of sense. It helps those pilots be able to feel like they can tell that they're depressed. That's why American Airlines does this, because they want you to tell them if you're depressed and a pilot. And if any of you are thinking of that Germanwings pilot who was depressed and flew into a mountain, dude was not depressed. Like, I'll send you the editorial we wrote in the Dallas Morning News. Dude was miserable and had a weird life and was not happy and was on an antidepressant, but nothing about his presentation was classic depression. He had a very specific personality type that is hard to define and that leads him to plot and kill hundreds of people. And yes, he was miserable, but that's not the same as depression. But with depression, I mean, let's say he'd had cancer, but we have said, you know, the pilot had cancer, and that's why he flew the plane into the mountain. I mean, you can make a story around that. He was distraught over the cancer. He was upset. His girlfriend broke up with him because he had cancer. We could make up narratives that would make sense of why a pilot would fly into a mountain because of cancer, but we don't do that. We only do that with mental illness. So we have a narrative problem and a storytelling problem in our field. So what happened because of this? Because of that, we perpetuate the stigma that mental illness isn't treatable because we talk about it in sloppy, non-precise, overly apologetic, and weak ways. The second thing we did was 2/3 of people don't seek care. Why would you seek care if I came in and told you that? Yeah, maybe, probably, maybe not though, and it'll probably suck, and it's embarrassing, and your friends will know you have depression, and they won't want to be your friends anymore. I mean, who would seek care? That's what we do. And then the last thing, and this is the worst part in many ways, not really, but it's a very bad part, is the insurance companies made us into a cost center. Any finance people in the room? You know what a cost center is? A cost center is a part of any industry that all you want to do is reduce their costs because they're not generating value. So like administration is a cost center. Like people don't want to spend very much on accountants because accountants aren't really why we're there. You need accountants. You want to spend as little as possible, but you want to spend as little as possible on the accountants. So what we did in the 90s was, actually, where's the drawing? Yeah, this drawing. What we did in the 90s was we had a thing called managed care. Anybody heard of managed care? Yes? Managed care. Managed care was this thing in the 90s that we put in place to control healthcare costs. Anybody ever heard of out-of-control healthcare costs? Yeah, okay. That's what managed care was about. And so in the 90s, we invented managed care to try to harass physicians and harass healthcare providers and get them to not do things they didn't need to do. And keep in mind, remember, I was keeping kids in my hospital for a year. I didn't need to do that. That was actually bad. So when mental health came in, what they did was they actually created a carve-out industry. There's a whole industry of specialty managed care organizations that only manage mental health. And what they came in and did was they said, let's get those kids out of the hospital in 2 weeks as opposed to a year. And they saved insurance companies tons of money. So in this drawing, we are the dark line that dips down. That was the cut and the amount of money that came out of the mental health system because of all those things we were doing before. And we are still living with that legacy today. We still have very little innovation in the field. We're still doing psychotherapy and inpatient care and emergency room care and medication. We are not, if any of you on your insurance needed something like assertive community treatment, early psychosis, like the collaborative care that they use for depression, almost any of those things you're not going to get paid for because those innovations were frozen, and there's this group of insurance companies out there that are plotting every day to spend as little on mental health as possible. And so what's happened, I don't expect you to absorb this, but the takeaway from this slide is he has lots of numbers and he knows what he's saying. So that's all you need to take away from this slide. Happens every 10 years, Health Affairs, which if you're in the healthcare industry at all and care about policy, subscribe to Health Affairs. My father-in-law was CEO to Blue Cross Blue Shield of Florida. He said, first thing you need to do is subscribe to Health Affairs, or find a friend who does because it's fairly expensive. You can get a student subscription for fairly cheap. But it's the journal for what's happening in the health industry. And every 5 years, they do a 25-year retrospective on what's been happening to mental health costs. And what's been happening to mental health costs is in 1986, we were almost 10% of overall health costs. By 1992, we were 8.2%. By 1996, we were 7.4%. Now, those seem, for those of you who don't know anything about statistics, like small changes, but they're actually huge changes by magnitude. That's a over 25% cut on our average costs. And we've never recovered from that. We're still about 7% of overall health costs. So health costs in the mental health field have been artificially kept low. Now, if you're an insurance company, you can be happy about that, right? Because you kept costs low. If you're a mental health provider, you're not happy about that. And if you're a human being, you're not happy about that because you know what the biggest impacts are of mental health conditions that aren't treated? They're down here. They're below the neck. So people with serious mental illness die on average in Texas 25 years before the rest of us do. I don't have a serious mental illness. Some of you do. We probably have a couple people who do in this room in this statistical sample. So if you're in that case, you die when you're my age. Actually, you die my age 2 years ago. I can't really, this talk has gotten a little old because I continue to age, but the statistics do not. So on 49 and a half, you die. Why do you die? Not from suicide, not from your psychiatric symptoms, but from untreated hypertension, untreated cardiovascular disease, untreated diabetes, chronic illnesses that kill you on average sooner, and also largely because of smoking. Smoking is a huge factor, and we actually encouraged, up until the 90s, people to smoke. So all these things happen, and that's why you die. And so that's why it's a bad idea for us to treat the brain over here and treat the body here. So that's really why we're in the problem we are. So let me pause for a minute. Does anybody have questions about any of this, or anybody have thoughts about this? Because we are going to do questions at the end. But earlier, I was going to tell you that you should feel free to ask questions or raise your hand during the talk, and I forgot to do that. So this is my chance to do that and see if you have any questions or things you want to talk about. Does it kind of make sense? Mostly? Okay, good. Let's stick with that. Yes, sir. Yeah. Why do they put that together? Yeah, they treat them because the industry's kind of moved in that way increasingly to treat them as behavioral health disorders. I personally don't like that they treat all mental health disorders the same because depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, PTSD are all very different presentations, clinical conditions that are in many cases comorbid. So I prefer actually for all of these to be treated as separate diagnoses. But the big reason they bundle them is all of them tend to be bundled into the same managed care carve-out corporations. So Magellan, Value Options, Beacon, and I like these people. They do good work. I'm not against them. I just think it was a bad idea for us to create that industry because they lump all that together. And both, for any of your employers, they have a choice between whether they want to just give you physical health care or whether they want to add in behavioral health. And typically you would add in these days both mental health and substance abuse, but you could get mental health only additions or substance use only additions. So it's the way the insurance company carves up healthcare expenditures to manage them and to keep them under control. Not a great idea. Well, from my perspective, but great idea for controlling costs in a narrow, short-term sense. Which, by the way, think of the other thing. What your employer ups their healthcare costs every year. They measure how much they're spending on you as an employee on an annual basis. So costs that take 20 years to manifest, they're not going to be around. I'm not going to be CEO of the Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute in 20 years, I promise you. So do I care? Well, yeah, I do care because I'm thinking about those things. But do most people care? They probably would care if they knew, but they probably don't know. So that's a big part of why these things happen. So what does a reattached brain look like? Well, you look around you, look at your neighbor. That's what a reattached brain looks like. That's what we should be treating, the entire brain and body. You can't actually see your neighbor's brain, probably. But you can tell that they have one because they're paying attention. And actually, very few people are looking at their phones. That's pretty cool. I'm impressed. So this is what it looks like, though, in the chart. And notice, here's the only there's a couple takeaways from this. It looks the same. See? We treat the brain the same as the body. So you go into your primary care doctor, you go into DePue's clinic, you go into some of the other clinics here, and you know what they do? They screen for depression. Just like they take your blood pressure, just like they take your temperature, just like they take your heart rate, they screen for depression. Do you know how long it takes to screen for depression? You have to answer two questions. And if you answer no to both, you're done. If you answer a high enough version of yes to both, you get 7 more questions. And we know with 80% to 90% certainty after those 9 questions that you have depression. I get screened for cholesterol and heart disease every time I go to the doctor. I have high cholesterol. I have had many conversations with my doctor about this. Do you know what high cholesterol means? Nothing. High cholesterol in and of itself gives a 50% chance of predicting a heart attack. Think about this, statisticians in the room. And the smartass that I am said to my doctor, well, why don't you just flip a coin? Because wouldn't that give you the same certainty that I am going to have heart disease as taking my blood and testing it? I mean, am I missing something here? So 80% chance. Why don't people do it? People will tell you that they don't do it. Some people, well, it's not a real test. I mean, it's a paper test. We ask them questions, right? It's not real. The only things that are real is if there's some bodily fluid that I can analyze and find a component of that bodily fluid and compare it to other people's bodily fluids, and it's different. No. Actually, science applies to words as well as bodily fluids. So what you should be looking at is the reliability of the test. I think the real reason they don't do it is because they don't want to know if you're depressed. Because if they know you're depressed, then they got to do something about it. And they don't know what to do, and they don't know who to refer you to, and it's going to make them sad because they don't want you to be depressed, just like I didn't want my son to be depressed. And so that's why they don't do it. They don't know what to do. So we got to give them something to do, and that's what integrated behavioral health does, is it puts in place practices for them to know what to do, just like integrated diabetes care. Anybody ever heard of integrated diabetes care? No, because why would we talk about that? Of course you do diabetes care at the doctor. We didn't used to do that. When I was a kid, there wasn't routine screening for that. Now there is routine screening for that. And do we catch everybody with diabetes? No, but we want to. We try. Do we screen everybody for depression? No, because we don't want to and we don't try. And so the PHQ-9 and other tests for anxiety and substance abuse that we should be asking in primary care and doing something about, because that's the best place to detect it, we could easily do tomorrow. And so that's what the future looks like, integrated primary care. And we would have sort of systems to coordinate. We'd schedule things. You know, it's scheduling. It's having doctors available and asking questions. It's a routine practice of medicine that we're trying to change. And I'll come back to this in a bit. But that's really the thing. So let's talk about who this applies to. And this sort of gets to your point earlier about who has a mental illness, who has a substance abuse. I think it's terrible to talk about mental illness. We don't talk about physical illness. Hi, I'm a physical illness doctor. What's your specialty? Physical illness. Which one? All of them. I'm a specialist in physical illness. We don't do that. People need to be specialists in depression, anxiety. I treat anxiety and depression. That's my specialty. If you have schizophrenia and psychosis, I know what that is. I know how to help you get to somebody. If you have a substance abuse, I'm probably going to try to treat that because I'm probably not going to be able to get you to someone else, so I got to learn how to do that as well. That's really, I think, state-of-the-art in treatment these days. But these are the issues that are out there. So here in the Valley, we have 1.3 million people, and every year we have 340,000 people, 1 in 5, who develop a mental illness. An illness. I'm not saying you're sad. I'm not saying you're worried about a test. Those are normal things. I'm not saying your mom died and you're sad. You can have a complex bereavement response, but those are all normal things that we don't call illnesses. Illnesses are when you're depressed and you're sad and you're grieving, but we don't think you have a good reason for it. Your body's doing it to you. That's depression. We can talk about other ones. The vast majority of mental illnesses are routine, and so we ignore them and don't do anything about them and don't detect them early until they get to be severe. And so when they do get severe, like let's look at this part. Oh, whoa, what just happened there? I turned that off. Do I have a laser pointer? Yeah, laser pointer. Right here, this yellow and red thing. When we talk often about mental illness, we talk about the people who are cycling through our emergency rooms. Out of the 340,000 people in the Valley with mental illness, only 1,100 are cycling through our emergency rooms every year. That is a number we could actually do something about. If we treated them earlier, when their episode of psychosis first emerges, right here, there's about 200 every year who first develop a psychosis. And those folks, if we aggressively treated them initially, the vast majority, we could stay on a developmental path, treat their psychosis successfully, and learn how to cope with that in society. So by breaking these illnesses out and doing the disease-specific treatments that the evidence suggests in specialty care and in primary care, we can do a much better job of treating serious mental illness. But people say, oh my gosh, that's so many people. How could we possibly treat all the depressed Texans? How could we do that? Well, it's not as many as have diabetes. 2 million Texans have diabetes, 1.5 million have depression. So if it's easier than diabetes, why aren't we doing it? Similarly with schizophrenia. Oh my gosh, schizophrenia, it's so hard to treat, it's so complex, it's so expensive to treat. It costs about $15,000 a year to do the evidence-based treatment for schizophrenia, about the same as a knee replacement. If my son blows his knee out playing football, y'all are going to pay for it. If my son blows his brain out with a psychosis, actually if his body blows it out, that's probably a bad metaphor. If his brain has a psychosis, we're not going to pay for it. I'd have to pay for that out of my pocket, and it'd be hard to find a provider. But there's actually 16,000 new cases of breast cancer every year and only 4,000 cases of psychosis. So I've been talking implicitly about a lot of the policies that need to change, but I think in many ways this diagram covers it. And then I'm going to go through this diagram and be done with that and then let you guys ask me questions or kind of have some discussion around this. So if we did this the right way, I think the analogy of orthopedic care would be the right way to do this. So there's a lot of orthopedic injuries. Anybody ever sprain their arm? Yeah? Sprained your arm. Okay. Sprained your arm, sprained your finger, sprained something. A sprain is an injury. But you don't go to an orthopedic specialist for a sprained arm. So if you're a child who sprains their arm at school, you're probably going to go to the nurse. You're probably going to be able to go to the nurse. That's similar to anxiety. The vast majority of mental illnesses people have aren't even depression, it's anxiety. And anxiety is a sensitivity to strangers, a sensitivity to school, a sensitivity to situations that cause you to avoid those situations and kind of not do an important part of your life. Well, if you sprained your arm and you never did anything about that, you would avoid, throwing a baseball. You would avoid setting the table, all the other things you need to do. We treat that through behavioral feedback and telling people, hey, lay off the arm for a while, but don't let them lay off it too much because it'll atrophy and there'll be problems and we'll lose other things. So that's the analogy we need to do. And so primary care docs can do that. Primary care docs, though, are not going to treat a broken arm that's complicated, a multiple fracture. They're going to send them to an orthopedic specialist. So we do need orthopedic specialists, but anything short of that pretty much can be treated in a primary care office. But we're also not going to send the little girl who shatters her leg in a car accident to the orthopedic specialist either, because that little girl is going to have to learn how to walk again. So we're going to fix her leg. The orthopedic specialist is going to do that, but there's going to be a whole team of therapists and OT professionals and other people who help that child learn how to walk again. We don't do that. In mental health today, we only pay for the psychiatrist or the therapist. We pay for the people, the specialists in the middle, and we have to figure out how to pay in those other extremes. And that's really what we're about at the Mental Health Institute. So we passed actually 15 laws last session where we worked with legislators, and we were able to pass a couple that were really important. One of them was we passed a law that lowered the licensing restrictions to keep out-of-state psychiatrists from practicing in Texas. One reason we have such a shortage is we have too few psychiatrists. Well, Texas is one of the most restrictive states if you want to move here from another state for all of our professions. I still haven't gone through my psychology licensure exam yet because it's a pain in the butt and it's going to take a while. When I moved to Michigan from Colorado, I sent them $150, proved to them I was a psychologist in Colorado, and they said, welcome to Michigan, be a psychologist. Here I got to take tests, I got to jump through all these hoops, and it's gotten better, but I haven't done it yet because I don't really need to feed myself. We passed laws that allowed us to fast-track psychiatrists. So when we steal Toyota executives and bring them here to Texas, we can also steal the doctors we need to bring them here as well. The other thing we passed last session, and we meaning Texas, not we meaning me, was to pay for screening in every well child checkup for children with Medicaid from age 11 up. So we're going to screen, and we're going to pay doctors to screen because guess what? If you pay people, they're more likely to do it. I know it's a very tough concept, but just go with me on it. And then the third thing we did was we paid for screening and treatment for depression for new moms. Again, in the Medicaid program, but to try to create pathways so we can do that. It's not rocket science, folks. It's paying for things, and it's also allowing people, this is actually one last thing that I promised Deepu I'd say, the whole range of clinicians. We restrict the numbers of clinicians a lot of times who can do things. And let me give you an example of how this can happen. How many of you have ever had a nurse help you when you were at your doctor's office? Anybody ever had a nurse come in and take their blood pressure? Okay. Who paid for the nurse? Does anybody know? Yes, who? You eventually, yes, you pay for everything. But who was the person who actually gave them their money? Yeah. The office, exactly, the doctor. It's bundled into the doctor's rate. The doctor's paid $90. The doctor pays the nurse. The doctor pays the receptionist. The doctor pays everybody else. Why? Because the doctor is convinced that those people will be helpful to her to have in her practice. So it's worth her while to make her practice more effective and to meet the metrics she needs to do around making sure. Because if your doctor doesn't take your blood pressure, they're going to get in trouble. Like they need to do that. They need to run tests. So the nurse can do all that kind of stuff. So we argue all the time about how do we pay for the behaviorists because there's a lot of research out there. That's what Deepu and the other folks who are doing integrated practice here have happen. Who pays for them? We have tons of arguments about this. What we eventually need to do is just get the frickin' doctor to pay them because it makes the doctor's life easier and help the doctor understand, which means we're going to have to train the doctor to pay attention to depression. We're going to have to change training programs. We're going to have to change certification programs, a lot of other things. And then who could be the behaviorist? Right now, Medicare will pay for some of this, but only if you're a social worker or a psychologist. What if you're a licensed marriage and family therapist or an LPC? You've got great training and credentials to do these things, but they're not going to pay for that. So what we're trying to do is to get people to get rid of these artificial barriers to payment, to get the data out there to convince doctors that these things work, and ultimately to change the dialogue so that we get society changed. So that you all, when you go into your doctor next time, has anybody been ever given a PHQ-9 at your doctor? Anybody? Raise your hand if you have. Richard, come on. Okay, good. I want to know who your doctors are because I want to go to your doctor. It's probably the doctors in your practice. My doctor doesn't do this. I go to the University of Texas Southwestern Medical School, big old fancy preventative cardiac doctor I go to. You know how they screen for depression with me? They said, are you depressed? I said, I don't know. I don't know. Probably not. And you mean the way they say, do you have thyroid cancer? They didn't ask me, do you have high cholesterol? They actually measured my blood to see. That's what they need to do. So you all can do that, when you go to your doctor. You could say, are you going to screen me for depression? Are you going to screen me for anxiety? And even if you don't care about that for your own life, do it, because we need to start asking our doctors those things. That's what's going to change. Ultimately, it's every one of you demanding and wanting mental health care that's going to change this in society. So I'm going to shut up and see if you have any questions or comments or feedback or things we could talk about. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Mental illnesses. Do you think they're underreported or overreported? The reason I bring that up is because I sometimes wonder that depression and the definition of depression, and we really apparently don't have an actual mechanism for defining it. But I'm just wondering if perhaps over the years, like we have, for example, with ADHD, kids that were normal a long time ago are now diagnosed with ADHD.
Yeah.
And in reality, they're just normal. And what we've done with being normal, it used to be a very broad spectrum, but now there's only a small population that's normal.
Yeah.
I mean, I drink, but I drink because I like to, not because I'm depressed. That's what I was asking about the substance abuse. Do you think that maybe they're overreported, and maybe our failure to basically accept the pressures or the stress associated with life? I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And in fact, I think, though, that one thing we got to keep in mind is normal really varies by culture. And this has been very carefully measured, and I actually don't agree with you at all about that we don't know how to define depression. It's very well defined. It's better defined, I would argue, than heart disease. But we can talk about that afterwards. But we have very good definitions for depression, and we see that actually people in developed countries have higher rates of depression. Well, does that make sense? No. I mean, we don't really know why that is, but they do have higher rates of depression. Everybody, I apologize to the millennials in the group. I don't personally believe this, but people will talk about millennials, right? Millennials, they have this, they demand this. I mean, we could also say that y'all are empowered to ask for things, that we taught you to, be more assertive. Well, are you tough? Are you tougher because you're assertive and you don't want to put up with certain job stresses that my generation put up with? Or are you empowered? I think the answer is yes, both. I mean, I think, if we, as a society, change in our expectations, what changes is the definition of functionality. And I think that's the issue. And that's what we need to have measures of, is functionality and impact on our life. So come to your drinking example. I have actually friends who are pretty much drunk every night. But they are highly functional. And they're highly functional with their spouses. They're highly functional at work. They don't drive drunk. They don't go to work drunk. But pretty much every night they drink 3 drinks or more, and they are seriously buzzed every night. And sometimes more than that. Are they alcoholics? By a narrow definition, and actually by physiological definition, yes. They're probably physiologically addicted. But are they ever going to go to the doctor? Will everybody bring that to the doctor's attention? No. Because functionally, they're fine. Now, I would argue if you do that for 20 or 30 years, you're going to start seeing effects on your body. There's going to be a lot of other negative effects of that. So what we need to do is that's what I was kind of saying earlier. We need to get better at measuring and capturing not just depressive symptoms, but what's the impact on your life. And if somebody really is depressed, they're not sleeping very well, they're not concentrating at work, it is going to have a functional impairment, and we know that they do. So we need to have the cutoff be not just, are you bummed, are you kind of not happy with your life, are you feeling like you want an antidepressant? We need to make the threshold a little bit higher, and the PHQ-9 does that. I mean, if you screen on a PHQ-9, you're at a level of severity that really is having functional impairment. But then you have to have a further conversation before you give someone a medication or a treatment to say what really is the functional impairment and make a decision with them. But you got to do that with cancer too. Like, I mean, I have another friend who had inoperable brain cancer, and so she went and talked to some people about, what could she do around that? She had some hard decisions to make. She clearly had a very bad disease state, but there wasn't anything to do about it, right? So she had to have a discussion about what's the right treatment, and in her case, she decided to not have any treatment and had actually a very unusual experience of it, went into remission kind of on its own. She's still alive today. I mean, what are the chances of that? But treatment decisions, I would argue, for every disease state have to take into effect functioning, impact on quality of life, and we just, frankly, I don't think are mature enough in the mental health field to have the sophisticated discussions we have around other disease states. So that's what I would say around it. Other questions or thoughts? Yes, sir.
More in regards like the PTSD, what is the state of Texas doing like with the judicial system, especially like being a veteran?
Yeah.
And then, but I'm over like some of the ones that are here now, but especially a lot of them that have come back with severe PTSD, and they get in trouble because of the mental illness of the PTSD.
Yes.
Which I've had in my past. I know what the VA is already doing about it, that it's diagnosed and there's already programs in place. But what is the state of Texas doing as far as with the judicial system? Because some have gotten in trouble like I did in the past, and it stays with you, and it creates a lot of problems in the future.
Well, first of all, this last question? Yeah, I will, yeah. Thank you for your question. Thank you for your service. But the question was about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, particularly as it impacts veterans here in Texas. And specifically, the impact and the effect of that within our judicial system, because a disproportionate numbers of veterans with PTSD end up coming to the attention of law enforcement, coming to the attention of our judicial system, and then getting into our judicial system and having some real problems. So there's actually been quite a few things that have been done. Is enough being done? No. But I think there's some unique things in Texas just in the last 2 years that have started, actually 3 years. So the first is the Senate Bill 55 grant program. So there is a special grant program in Texas that is designed to fill gaps in care for veterans and their families, because the VA doesn't pay for everything. I mean, here's an important policy thing. Guess what? If you served in Iraq, you had a combat tour duty, and you were dishonorably discharged because you had post-traumatic stress disorder and you got drunk and you punched your master sergeant in the face and you were dishonorably discharged, you have no access to the VA. How messed up is that? I mean, really? I mean, we could argue that the entire reason why that happened was because of PTSD, but you don't get VA benefits. So there's veterans all over the country who don't have access to VA services because they're dishonorably discharged, disproportionately because of PTSD and other reasons. Also, a lot of veterans don't want to go get their care at a VA. It's not close, they don't like the VA, and it's interesting, right? We say, it's almost like we take your rights away as a Texan to go anywhere else for health care and insist that you go to the VA. If you go to a mental health center, not today, but 4 years ago, you were very likely to be told if you were a veteran, you need to go to the VA because we need to use our funds for someone else. How messed up is that? So those policy changes have been made. So now if you go into tropical Texas behavioral health, you'll be treated just like every other Texan. So we've made it easier to get access. In the court system last week, or 2 weeks ago, the Texas Supreme Court and the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, which are the two overarching courts in our system, established a mental health commission, which isn't formally established yet, but is about to be launched, to train judges to understand mental illness, and one of the particular things we're going to be training judges on is PTSD, and to try to encourage judges to set up veterans' dockets, to have separate ways of processing, to take extra effort to work with a veteran, and to give them a special attention in recognition of their service and the special burdens that many bring back. But also we need to combat the stigma that every veteran has PTSD, because that's another thing veterans tell us about, is that we aren't careful about that. We don't point out that really PTSD is a normal response to an abnormal situation. And some of our folks, when they go over, have such extreme experiences that impact them in a way that they do have PTSD, but it's a Anyway, so we're doing that. So the courts are making some good things, but a lot of that comes down to your local judges here. What are your local judges doing? What does your local sheriff do? What are the practices here in this county? And that's really, what we have 254 counties, right? So it's county by county, and there's a lot of work to be done there. But I think there's some good tools to use, and those are all policy changes that happened in the last 3 years. So I'd be happy to talk to you more about any of those if you have specific questions. Maybe do one more question? Yeah, cool. Or comment? Yes, sir.
Great. So what do we do as students, as faculty, as people within this community? What do we do besides bringing awareness, besides being conscious of these things? Who do we call?
Yeah, well, so first of all, I would say it would be great to organize and know, who do you call? Like, so who are the places in your town you can go to if someone has a mental illness? What are the clinical practices for primary care that are doing integration, and promote those. Talk those up in the community. Make sure that those providers are well known in the community so people can say, hey, I'm going to go see Dr. Smith because Dr. Smith does the PHQ-9. Dr. Smith has good care. And I think that creates, you need to learn about your community. And believe me, at some point you're going to need to learn this. I mean, my wife had back problems 3 years ago. Guess what? Now we know where all the good back doctors are. And we had to spend about 6 months figuring that out. Every medical condition has good people practicing and less good people practicing. So start having dialogue in your community about who's doing a good job. Second thing you can do is go get your mental health checked out and tell people you did. You don't have to tell people if you're depressed, and I don't recommend that you indiscriminately tell people if you're depressed, because there could be real consequences of that. Just like if you have Parkinson's disease, I recommend you be careful about who you tell that, because your employer may be concerned if you have Parkinson's disease or cancer. I mean, there's a lot of severe illnesses or debilitating illnesses or minor illnesses which people are prejudiced against and also have real impacts, right? I mean, you are going to have some impact from depression at work. It's treatable. But to encourage your friends to get treated out. And one thing about the under 30 crowd in here is y'all do that. I mean, everybody I know under 30 talks about this very routinely. My son, I said, hey, you okay if I talk about your depression and my talks? He goes, yeah. He goes, why? I go, well, I just feel like people, he goes, why are you asking me? I go, well, it's your illness. Why should you get your permission? He goes, yeah, whatever, okay, Dad. I mean, he doesn't care. Like, he'll tell people he doesn't mind that he's on depression. He takes like 10 pills a day. I'm like, are you worried about what your roommate's going to say? He goes, well, my roommate takes pills. I mean, like, doesn't matter. And that's kind of what the gentleman was saying earlier about some of the prevalence of mental illness. I don't think the prevalence has gone up dramatically. What's happened is our awareness of it has gone up. So I don't really think there's like an epidemic. I just think we're now aware of it. This epidemic of people in the jail with mental illness, it ain't new. There's always been people with mental illness in the jail. We just care about it now and are trying to do something about it. And this is the one thing I'd ask you to not do. Don't ever say the system is broken. And if someone says the system is broken, try to gently correct them, because think about what broken means. Like, if a plate is broken, that means that the plate had to be whole at one point. It was a good functioning plate, and you drop it and it's broken. Who dropped the mental health system? When was the mental health system unbroken? Never. We haven't built this yet. This is what we're doing, right? We have only had a child welfare system in this country for as long as I've been around, which isn't very long, 50 years. I mean, we've only started to try to combat some of these things, so don't feel ashamed that we haven't figured out how to deal with all this. Like, say that we're going to figure this out. That's what your generation my generation will be done in about 10 years. Your generation will pick it up. Your generation is kind of in between. That's what we need to do. And so let's build it over the next 20 years. Because, 1986, when my grandma died with no preventative cancer treatment, wasn't that long ago. And what's changed since then? People started having races for the cure. People started defining what remission means. People started talking about prevention. People went to schools and they taught young women how to do breast exams, taught young men how to do testicular exams. We giggled and laughed and made fun of each other during that. But, there's hilarious. Senator Watson from if you ever hear him talk about this stuff, he's great. He's from Austin. But he'll talk about his testicular cancer and all that, and he'll say, you realize what I've been talking about in front of you for the last 30 minutes, and I'm not at all embarrassed talking about a very private part of my body, but I wouldn't talk about my depression. I mean, it's ridiculous when you think about it. It's understandable, but we need to get past that. So I think you can sort of, just like we do with other stigmatized things, you can speak out, you can seek good health care, and you can help your friends find good health care, just like you would if they had a back problem. So that's what I would say. And if you go into the profession, or if you go into politics, or if you go into law enforcement or the law, there's some way more specific things you can do, which the mental health that we are set up to do. So if you have more specific questions about populations you care about, veterans, children, call us. We're here. This is our job. We are paid to be here every day to help you scheme and figure out how to make these policies better. So call us if you have more specific questions. Good? Thank you all. Appreciate you being here today.
I want to thank all of you for coming. I think we had some important questions that were raised. So one of the things that I reminded folks who attended our last lecture was to be more mindful when you do go for your healthcare checkups and ask them for things. Do you screen for depression? Do you have a behavioral health provider that I can talk to if I had some issues in the future, or just learning how to cope with my diabetes or other conditions a little better? So part of that voice starts with the consumer, which is all of you. So hopefully you're going to think about that next time you go to your doctor's visit, and then you see the nurse and you see the doctor, then you may want to think about who else needs to be there in that team so that you can sort of reattach the body to the head and get a whole person treatment. Right now, the UTRGV Family Medicine Residency Clinics have integrated behavioral health. Hope Family Health Center has integrated behavioral health. Nuestra Clínica del Valle has integrated behavioral health. So there are a lot of pockets in the valley. The Rio Grande State Center has integrated behavioral health. So there are a lot of pockets in the valley that these services are being co-opted and operated. And I think for us, we are in the journey to figuring out how to make that sustainable over the next several years, so that the psychologist or the social worker is like the MA that'll get paid for. I hope you will take some of your questions and thoughts and not let it die on your way out, and it'll inform the decisions you make, healthcare choices you do, and hopefully the studies that you will do. Thank you all for coming.